A very good evening to the participants and the speakers. I hope I'm audible. Naveen, can you give me a heads up, please?
Yes, Aksha, you're audible.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Friends of Elephants event for the last month of the year, that is December 2021. Most of us are already aware of what exactly Friends of Elephants is, but I would like to give a brief introduction for those who are attending this event for the first time. So, Friends of Elephants is not an organization and it is not proposing to become one. It is an informal group of people who come together with varied expertise concerned about elephants and other wildlife. The group is a forum for disseminating knowledge linked to elephants and other wildlife science, conservation, and welfare through art, culture, literature, movies, talks, and panel discussions. Our expectation is that people who have attended our events conducted at this capital city on their own or with their proximity to the people from policy making help in developing appropriate conservation and welfare measures for wildlife, including elephants. So, even with all the restrictions in travel for the last 2 years, we were able to get a glimpse of different landscapes through these events as experts took us through their experiences. And for the last 5 months, we have been drawing parallels between elephants and other species like leopards, swamp deer, bears, and even crocodiles in our events. This time, we have a wonderful opportunity to understand the similarities between primates and elephants as our speakers, Ms. Seema and Dr. Sharma, will walk us through the landscape of Northeast India. Most of us stand in awe of this pristine landscape. Nestled amidst the mighty Brahmaputra river system and in the foothills of Himalayas, Northeast has a high species richness, diversity, as well as endemism. The lives of people here are deeply rooted in the forests, and the same is reflected in their tradition, culture, occupation, and religion. This unique biodiversity and social complex makes Northeast India harbor a large population of Asian elephants as well as primate species, including the holar gibbon in the country. However, with rapid changes in the habitat and distribution, entail various challenges for both species. To give us a clear perception about the conservation challenges, I would like to invite our speaker to share her experience with elephants in this prime primate landscape. I would like to introduce Ms. Seema Lokhanwala. She studies elephant communication and behavior in the Kaziranga Karbi Anglong landscape. She is an engineer turned conservation scientist who is interested in integrating the latest technologies with data and concepts from elephant communication, behavior, and ecology to promote wildlife conservation. Seema is a PhD candidate at the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. More recently, she has founded the Elephant Acoustics Project, which aims to develop and deploy state of the art technology to monitor and understand elephant presence in an area to mitigate human elephant conflict. So, without further ado, I request Ms. Seema to please take over. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you, Aksha, for that wonderful introduction. And I think she wonderfully explained the idea of Northeast of India, which is a very biodiverse area. So I'll just present a very short talk about the challenges that we face in currently in the Northeast from a perspective of elephants. One second, I'm just trying to share my screen. Are you able to see the screen, everyone?
Yes,
Yes,
Seema, you're able to.
Yes, fine. Just okay. So first of all, thank you, Friends of Elephants, for giving me the opportunity to speak about this topic, which is very close to my heart. And I work in the Northeast for a very long period of time now. And I'm going to present today the challenges that is currently faced by elephants in this landscape. So as we know, humans and wildlife have shared habitats and resources from the prehistoric times to the present date. And all of these conflict has started happening when humans, from becoming hunters and gatherers, they have this settled form of agriculture becoming the livelihood. So land then became a commodity which we can own. And this interface of land has resulted in conflict between humans and wildlife. But most of the literature has looked at it only from a point of view of negative. And how can we move from this conflict to coexistence, or let's say people like to use the word cohabitation, is what we need to move forward to. So there are other species also which are dominated by conflict, which is the leopards and the wild boars, which is a huge conflict. The conflict because of wild boars is very high, and so does primates. And our next speaker, Dr. Narayan Sharma, sir, who will be discussing about conservation challenges with primates, I'll mostly be talking only related to elephants. Okay, so the northeast of India, when you look at the map of India, you see the northeast being one of the most biodiverse green areas. Luckily, it's green, but it is highly fragmented, which has resulted in such a lot of conflict. These is like green, small pockets. You don't have huge landscapes like what we talk about in the African savannas, or let's say any other places like the Congo Basin. But you have very highly fragmented areas, which results in conflict. So why is there conflict only with elephants? And why does that occur? Because elephants are large bodied mammals. They like to eat about 150 kgs of food per day. That's what they consume. And they eat around 16 to 20 hours a day, because of which they have to travel a long distance, which is they're a wide ranging area. And that results when they come from one fragment of area to another. And when they're moving between this areas, there is a chance of meeting humans, which results in conflict. So currently we have 60% of global population of wild elephants in India, out of which the second largest population is in the northeast, the first being Karnataka. And most of these free-ranging elephants are found in a forest, within forested area of over 110,000 square kilometer. But out of this 110,000, it's only 22% is protected. The rest is non-protected. So when we make policy changes or any of the other landscape level, we should plan everything at landscape level, because most of the elephant habitat lies outside landscape level. And there are mostly degraded forests. There are human habitations or agricultural lands, which is in some ways elephant habitats now they have become, and which has resulted in conflict. Now, what amount of conflict is it? There are around 500 humans, more than 500 humans which die, and more than 100 elephants which die because of these conflict. And it's not just about death, it's about this long-term physiological stress that a human and an animal goes through while interacting with each other. Even the humans which live around these areas of conflict, high conflict zones that we call of, where the elephants do come across every day, every night, there is a lot of stress that happens to those humans. If we talk to those humans in those communities, there is a long-term physiological stress that they go through. So what does conflict look like? Something like this, which is a recent in 2015, which is electrocution. When an elephant comes out, it can be easily electrocuted by either humans intentionally or unintentionally. It can, there could be death on the human side also, because the elephants is just trying to move away in a place, but the humans try to chase away. So there is different forms of conflict that happen. Unluckily, in Northeast and certain areas, certain districts, the conflicts are increasing, which is like the Golaghat district recently. Now, why is the conflict increasing in Northeast much more? Because the human population is growing. Also, Northeast is recently going through this phase of linear development, which is there are a lot of linear development projects that are coming up in Northeast. And these having a lot of negative interactions between humans and elephants. Also, elephants are taking refugees inside tea and coffee plantations. They're using township settlements and agriculture area. And I spoke about this whole thing. Yes.
I request all of you to kindly keep your microphone on mute.
Okay. I'll just
Sorry,
go for
Seema.
no worries about it. I was just taking a break. So because of I spoke about this hidden cost of conflict, And because of this, there is a weakened physiological well-being, and there is a huge level of disruption of livelihoods and food insecurity in the Northeast, especially. Now, the other that Aksha spoke about is Brahmaputra River. The river, this is a landscape that I worked in, Kaziranga, Karbi Anglong. Now, this is one of the reasons that conflict occurs, because the whole left-hand side is when the park is completely flooded. And elephants have to move within this fragmented landscape. On the right, you see everything is green, but it is not green. There are tea estates. All of these green is tea estates, and the elephants have to cross within these tea estates to go through the higher level, which are the hills on the right hand side. Left hand side is Kaziranga Park, which gets completely flooded, and this is the national highway that passes through National Highway 37. And on the right hand side is the Karbi Anglong area, which is the hilly region. So this all results in human wildlife conflict. And this is how the elephants are crossing the road. And most likely every evening you see humans on both the side. Luckily, now the forest department has put in efforts, and there are corridors, and elephants are crossing. They are been given right of passage in some ways, and they have been able to cross, which is a good thing. Now, how to mitigate this conflict, which we understand some bit of there is conflict. We have to look at landscape level, because no protected, without undermining the importance of protected area, we have to plan everything at a landscape level. And also this whole community interaction becomes a very important thing, that we have to give space to elephants, and we have to develop new technology in some ways as well, to identify if we can use technology to detect elephant presence in the area. And also the technologies that are already available, how can we upgrade it? There is some technologies that are available, how can we upgrade it? So that's the idea. I understand that technology has been a boon and curse in both sense. The result of pollution and resource depletion, everything is happening because of, in some ways, extraction of technology. And there is a lot of consumption that's happening because of technology. It has resulted in very, very habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, deforestation, all of that. But how are we going to get out of it? Because technology is going to stay with us. Now, how are we going to use it as a boon is what we really need to move forward to, rather than just looking at as a curse. So that's what my idea and my project is looking at. So this is the study area. Of course, we talked about it. It's the northeast of India. And the challenges now with technology is what I'm talking about. So let's say this is a solar fence, which which we put to, so that the elephants don't come inside the elephants don't come inside the agricultural land. Unluckily, the elephants learn, they're very highly intelligent species, so they learn how to break these solar fences. Wherever I worked, in most of the places, including Kodagu, where I worked, the elephants could easily break these solar fences. They would either understand that their tusks don't conduct electricity, so hence they would just use their tusk to throw the fence away, or they would get a branch from somewhere far off and just break the fence. So luckily this just doesn't work for us, just doesn't work for us. So we would have to develop something else. And then we developed hanging fence. When we developed hanging fence, it's a really costly, if comparatively much costly. The maintenance of it is costly because it's like hangs through it. But of course, as you might know, that cattle needs to pass through protected areas. In certain areas, certain cattle are allowed to feed allowed to feed within protected areas. So this is hanging fence helps the cattle to pass through. So at least the villagers around the area don't break the solar fence. But the cost of it is very high. The effectiveness is much better than the solar fence. The elephants currently are not able to break the hanging fence, at least in the areas in Assam that have been put into, but the cost of it is very high. Now, the other technology that we are using recently is radio collaring. Now, what would you do if an elephant that has come into a Guwahati city, which is a 9 lakh, 10 lakh populated city, and it roams about in the city full time? The elephant, the one that came over here, was drunk elephant. It, in some ways, it was highly intoxicated. It smelled like it was highly intoxicated. So you lift the elephant, you put a radio collar on the elephant. When you put a radio collar of the elephant, you could identify the elephant is roaming only within a habitat of humans. It is only roaming when we radio collared it within a forested area, which is the rightmost dot point. It was roaming the whole time only within a human dominated landscape, which is a cantonment area. It never went inside any of the protected areas. What do you do with elephants like this? But radio collar, at least with technology, has given us an idea on where the elephants are moving. Earlier, we never used to know where the elephants are moving and for how long are they coming up. And also, this radio collar only worked. One more challenge with the radio collar is this radio collar only worked for a short while and could not last longer because the elephant had an injury in its leg and used to lie down in the water most of its time. So the water went inside the insulation box, which is on the top, and hence the radio collar failed. So we need to make more radio collars which are more resistant, at least more resistant to the weather that the Northeast faces. Also, there are radio collars that have worked. These are GPS radio collars, VHF radio collars, which have been able to detect home ranges of elephants. And they say that the elephants in certain areas of Assam do come from West Bengal as well. So this long-term radio collaring is much more effective, and we could do long-term radio collaring to detect at least conflict elephants, because not every elephant is a conflict elephant, means comes out of protected areas and is in interacting with humans a lot more. So when you identify these plots, you see these are home ranges. And when they're coming out of these home ranges, they are walking along this particular path. And this particular path is what we call as elephant corridors. And these elephant corridors need to be identified all across the landscape, which is currently going on, that a landscape level elephant corridor project is going, where they are trying to identify elephant corridors, which will help, at least if we are not able to protect the whole area, at least some patches of land where the elephants are definitely crossing could be protected, which will help in long-term conservation. So the project that I'm working on is the elephant acoustic project, and we are trying to develop an elephant sensor. The elephant sensor, in some ways, and why do you use the word acoustic? Because elephants are highly social being. They like to communicate with here you can see that there is such a long communication that can happen from a population to a central subpopulation to a clan level, bond group, family unit. And you can see that these one individual is interacting till the level of population. So they interact a lot. And how do they interact? There is tactile communication, but one of the major interaction is through acoustic communication. And there are various calls that they make while they're communicating within one another. So there are 4 types of elephants call that have been detected. One is the trumpet, the roar, the chirp, and the rumble. But our acoustic device currently is based out of rumble, and the device works on these principles that we are trying to detect elephants before they come into human dominated landscape. And you use an acoustic deterrent to move elephants away from the area, rather than asking, once they have come inside the once they have come inside the human habitat, then how to move them away. And the acoustic deterrent should, what we plan to do is have a deterrent with at least multiple calls, so that they don't get used to one call, like have bees, have leopard calls, have tiger calls. And it should be area specific. Like we say that if the area has natural predation of tigers, which is in the case of Kaziranga, we should have multiple tiger calls or leopard calls, which has a high predation. What elephant's predation is elephant calf predation, because elephants, large and animals like elephants don't have, but at least the calf do have predation by tigers. So that should be the part in which we're trying to make the acoustic sensor. That the idea in the end is to have an early warning system which will detect elephant calls and make the send the message to the sensor that there is elephant presence in the area. That presence will be then sent to a server, and that server will then play an acoustic deterrent, which will help in moving the elephants away from the area. Okay. And now over here, I'll talk about a story about this particular elephant and about the cultural change, about how it has happened, especially in the case of Assam. This elephant has been named Bin Laden, because was a conflict elephant had killed 6 humans in the district of Golpara. It was ordered by the chief wildlife warden to radio collar this elephant and put it in an unknown place, which we could not name it. And unluckily, the political turn take place in such a way that this elephant had to be captured and put it into captivity. Unluckily, within captivity, within 2 weeks, the elephant died. Hence, there is a really sad reality that we need policy change. We would not be able to have elephants. Either we have to radio collar such elephants and put into unknown locations, or definitely we need to do something of problematic elephants. If at least captivity is not the option for large mammals like this, because they will die in captivity. So when I talk about policy change, I'm talking about looking, of course, at landscape level and without undermining the importance of protected areas. And at landscape level, I am trying to identify factors. When you do factors, you can't say that everything has to be protected. We have to identify based on food availability, human density in the area, and of course, distance from protected areas, and where is the major water source in that area. And this approach has to be from the conservation planning so that it will contribute at policy change. And both, luckily, at the global and local level scale, now we are looking at level at conservation planning is happening at community level. It is not happening at a, it is not just happening at it is not just happening at, I would say, sorry, I think it is happening now much more at a community level, and it is not just happening at localized level. It is happening much more. So for instance, in early 2020, uh, at the 13th conference of COP of the UN Convention of Conservation of Mitigation Migration Species held in Gandhinagar, Asian elephants were added in Appendix 1, and which give them the strictest protection and safe passage for elephants migrating between different nations, which is a really good thing. Also, more NGOs and conservationists now from, the word was forest conservation. I was looking for that word, the forest conservation to community level, which is a really, really good thing that's happening. And more conservation projects nowadays are including community, including the ones that we are working in, and it helps in so that locals to get to garner the support for wildlife conservation. We get more support of locals, which is very, very important. Now, when I showed you the photo of uh, the Bin Laden, the Osama bin Laden, what has happened is there is a perspective of people. There is a tolerance with the people. I'm going to end with a story of how this perspective of people is changing in Assam. Okay. So once I went to in December, I went to a small village in Balipara. There is a teeming 2 kilometers from a township of Tezpur, and it was really cold weather. And in October and December is the month where paddy is harvested. It is stockpiled outside farmers. It was stock. The paddy that was harvested was stockpiled outside farmers' house. And then that one night when I was there, about 150 elephants entered the village and created havoc. And that time I met a lady and she was completely calm. And after all that havoc that was created by the elephants that were feeding on the paddy that was just right outside her house, she referred the elephants as gods. But in just some time back, on the same episode, in different incident, 11 elephants were poisoned in Sonitpur district, and they on that carcass it was written Dhanchor bin Laden. That means an paddy thief bin Laden. So there is this reference from elephants being referred to as Ganesh Baba to bin Laden. And this tolerance is what currently we have elephants in India. But if we are playing on this tolerance, and if this tolerance level is tested of the locals and we don't give back the locals, we might never have elephants in future, at least from the perspective of some areas. At least some areas the tolerance level has reached such that we will not have elephants in that area. So this growing intolerance in the minds of people because of this recurrent crop raiding and delay of compensation by forest department, as well as lack of proper mitigation support, is what is recurring this change of perspective that's happening from Ganesh Baba to Dhancho. So we really need to have more innovative, more technologically driven mitigation measures at institutions level that govern human-elephant interface. We really need it, and we need to support this culture of tolerance, which is very much relevant in India's perspective. At the other end of the line, I do see hope because there are a lot of technology that's happening and it's growing in a much more faster way. There are new radio collars also coming in. There are more railway fences that are coming in that might work. But we still need a more holistic approach towards wildlife conservation, at least in perspective of India. Thank you. I'm ready. I can, yeah. Thank you. Sanjay, can you take over?
Yeah, thank you, Seema. It was a really interesting presentation.
Just this.
Akshay, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Seema. It was a really interesting presentation. And thank you for sharing your experiences and your work with the latest technology. Now, we move on to the second segment of our event. So now we have a very informal conversation with primate expert Dr. Narayan Sharma with Seema Lokhandwala. The conversation will be in the lines of connecting links, complex social organization behavior and conservation concerns between elephants and primates. As I already mentioned, that Northeast is a primate landscape, and with Dr. Narayan Sharma's expertise, we can have very interesting insights. Before we move into this, I would like to give a brief introduction of the speaker. Dr. Narayan Sharma is an assistant professor and head, Department of Environmental Biology and Wildlife Sciences at Cotton College. He did his PhD from National Institute of Advanced Studies and Manipal University and MSc Zoology from Department of Zoology, Guwahati University. He studies community and behavioral ecology and the conservation biology of primates in fragmented landscape of Upper Brahmaputra Valley of northeastern India. He is also interested in political, human, and landscape ecology as well as ecological history. He is a member SSC Primate Specialist Group IUCN 2006 onwards. Member IUCN SSC Reintroduction Specialist Group South Asia 2010 onwards. Member International Primatological Society 2010 onwards. He has co-authored around 20 research papers, articles, book chapters in peer-reviewed international journals of repute. So I request Dr. Sharma and Ms. Seema to kindly take this conversation forward.
Hello, sir. Good
Hi,
evening.
Seema. Good evening.
Oh. So, of course, I spoke about elephants, a little bit about the challenges in technological perspective. I would like to know, what do you think are the challenges faced both by elephants and primates in common in the Northeast? What could you think of both of them in common?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to discuss some of the conservation issues of primates. So I did my master's in, my PhD in primates, and briefly my postdoc in elephants. So with Dr. M.D. Madhusudan. And basically it was looking at the distribution of elephants in Karnataka. So that is my expertise with primates, and also with elephants. And also while I was following primates in Holangapar Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary, which is a small area of around 20.98 square kilometer located in Upper Assam. But it also has 40 odd elephants, so in just area of less than 20 square kilometer. So my encounter with elephants was while I was following primates to do my behavioral observations, and most of the time I used to encounter them because while you follow the primates, since the primates also share the same habitat as elephants, and many a time I thought that there are common food resources. For example, the stump-tailed macaque, which is one of the macaques that I followed, and the elephants, they both love bamboo, so bamboo culms. So, in fact, when I was looking at what are the food resources shared by different primate species, that was one of my PhD objective. I found that, in fact, the stump-tailed macaque is sharing more resources with elephants rather than the primates. So, if we look at the primate and the elephants, I think the most important concern for both of them is the habitat loss in Northeast India. So Seema has shown that very nice green patches, and she also said that it's highly fragmented. But I'd like to add one more thing, that even though they are fragmented, the forest in most of these patches are highly degraded. So if you go to a forest in, say, Upper Assam, so you may see a very good canopy cover. But if you go inside and see the local people, and there is a very chronic extraction of forest resources from this forest, so that makes the underground completely devoid of say saplings, tree saplings, or the recruitment or the population structure is very different if you look at the forest from inside. So I think along with habitat loss and fragmentation, and the habitat degradation is I think one of the very important factors that affecting both primates and elephants. In fact, when Seema was showing that why the elephants are not going to forest, rather than they are moving around the human habitations in Guwahati. So if you go to just this next of Guwahati is the Samchang Wildlife Sanctuary. And this sanctuary, if you go to towards this sanctuary, you may see the entire forest or say the greenery is composed of monocultures. So most of these are teak plantations. So or the rubber or the sal plantation in some of the part in Gwalpara district where the conflict is too high. So I think both primates as well as the elephants. So I think the character of the forest has changed. The original forest, which used to be a mixed forest with a dense canopy and also the dense undergrowth with a lot of say saplings and the seedlings, these are not more in most of the cases. So if you go, it's highly degraded. Only the tall trees or some of the monocultures in many of these reserve forests are there. So I think though it looks very green from outside, if you look at from the satellite imagery, you may say that, okay, there is so many forest cover. In fact, FSI has said that between 2017 and 2019, Gwalpara, there is an increase of forest cover of 97 square kilometer. So when we did our study, we found that this 97 square kilometer is nothing but the rubber plantation. So I think we need to really define the forest in a very strict way if really wanted to get a good understanding of the forest cover. Because if we do that in a very strict way, we may see that the original forest cover is much lesser than what currently projected in many of these government's reports. So for me, the habitat loss is the primary concern for both elephants as well as the primates. And also I think Seema briefly touched about the linear infrastructure, the incursion of road in most of the primate as well as the elephant habitat. And there are a lot of death due to the when they try to negotiate this railway crossing. For example, Deepar Bill, which is very close to Guwahati, it's lying between there is a railway track that's lie between Deepar Bill and the Rani Gorbanga Reserve Forest. And while elephants are coming from this Rani Gorbanga and try to go to Deepar Bill to drink and to eat some of the aquatic vegetations, they are being mowed down. So around 11 elephants have died so far while negotiating that track. So and that is one case in Deepar Bill. And if you look at the incursion of linear infrastructure in India and in Assam, you may see the numbers are really going up. And I think we need like some better say policies while taking care of the linear infrastructures. So recently this, I think all of you know that there is a strong push for palm cultivation in Northeast India. In fact, 11,040 crores has been earmarked to expand palm cultivation in Northeast India and Andaman and Nicobar. I think that will also change the landscape to a larger extent, giving rise to, so for example, if you look at Gwalpara and the hotspot of say elephant conflict, so it's not only because there are a lot of this pull and push factors. So elephants are so coming out of the Garo Hills, and because there are a lot of paddy in the valley, and because elephant were not able to say get their minimum fodder requirement in Garo Hills. So I think there are both pull and push factor. When they come out of the forest, they encounter paddy, and also the huge promotion of the banana in that banana cultivation in that part, and also the rubber plantations, the sal plantation, and now the oil palm cultivation. So I think together with all these different land use changes, I think this conflict was inevitable, and that's why I think when Seema showed about the Ladin, and which was unfortunately died while in captivity. So that kind of say conflict is even now as I speak. I think there must be elephants in somebody's paddy fields or somebody's backyard. So yeah, so I think the habitat loss, habitat degradations, expansion of monocultures. In Upper Assam, it's mostly tea, but tea happened long back. But the small tea growers, and there are many state unclassified forests which have been converted to tea gardens along Assam and Arunachal, and along Assam and Nagaland borders. So the landscape has changed, the forest has been degraded. So this is I think one of the most important issues that affecting both elephants as well as primates in northeastern India.
So thank you for that explanation. So I just wanted to know, even with so much of challenges currently that are faced by elephants and primates, then also their Northeast still has this high level of primate endemism. There's so many primates that are only found in the Northeast and nowhere found elsewhere. Why is such so?
If you look at the Northeast India, it's the location is very, very crucial. So it's lying at the confluence of say Palearctic and the Oriental biological realm. So we have elements of both Oriental as well as the Palearctic. So, and there are a lot of primate species which colonized Northeast, so-called colonized Northeast India long back. So if Brahmaputra River, if you look at the south of Brahmaputra River, you will see Hulak gibbon, stump-tailed macaque, and pigtail macaque. They say those were the Southeast Asian elements, and there is one species of golden langur, langur, which is called the golden langur, which is found along this 5,000 square kilometer area in Bhutan and Assam. So, and that is the endemic species. Also, there are other endemic species such as Assamese macaque, and recently there is this white cheek macaque was also discovered from Arunachal. So Arunachal, I think it's because of its locations and also the topography. I think there are a lot of scope for speciation to happen. So these are some of the reasons why Northeast India is so rich in primate diversity, because we have elements of both Southeast Asia as well as the Indian subcontinent. So some of the species like rhesus macaque, which are found along towards the both bank of river Brahmaputra, Assamese macaque also towards the both bank of river Brahmaputra, cap langur also they tend to migrate. They tend to found in both bank of Brahmaputra. Slow loris, which is a nocturnal species, is found there, but there are certain species which are restricted towards south bank of river Brahmaputra. So even in Northeast India, they're not uniformly distributed everywhere. So so the locations as well as the topography as well as the climate, because it's highly productive tropical rainforest, or in some cases there are lowland tropical rainforests which are which are quite supportive for the species. For example, when I was walking in to look at how these three primate species were able to coexist in one particular habitat of Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary, so I found that most of them have, say diversified their either the food or the habitat that they are using. So within a forest also they have a differential space and the food use. I think this happened over a evolutionary time scale, so that even within a forest, so you can see at least in Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary there were 7 species of primates in the 20 square kilometer area. So this biogeographical region as well as the localized say resource partitioning that actually allowing this amazing diversity of primates in northeastern India.
So you extensively also study behavior, especially when you're talking about behavior ecology. So I've come across this the recent killing that has happened of a group of monkeys killing around 250 dogs, and all the media reporting as that revenge killing. And I wanted to, if you could link that with elephants, do you think that is that revenge killing? Is that word itself a right word to use? And
Not,
also,
yeah. I think not
and
at all. Not at all. They will not take grudge or they will wait for. It's like a snake, like having memory. And if you kill a say male snake and a female snake or male snake, the male will or a female will come and bite you. So I think these are little bit far-fetched conclusions. So apparently, I also read extensively about that incident. Actually, what happened there. So apparently there are 3 or 4 puppies which were caught by these primates, and they have this habit of taking these puppies and they took it to the trees or house roof where they actually died. So and I think there is a lot of these exaggerations of people. So and they attribute a lot of these human emotions, right? Revenge and the kind of badla kind of thing. So I don't think this have that these primates or elephants have that kind of attitude. So I think there's a lot of anthropomorphism of this incidences. So and people tend to exaggerate. I think there is a real importance is to look at the people perception. I think Seema will understand that people will say something, and if in the reality this is a completely different thing. So there is a perception and there is a reality, and sometimes it matches. So I'm not saying that all of the time the perception is not matching with the reality, but most of the time I think people exaggerate because I'll narrate one incident here. So I'll not mention the name of the district where I was asked to train the forest department people who will eventually go and do a private survey. And after I think after 2 or 3 days of training, and they went and they did a census, and they came out with a number of 75,000 rhesus macaque in one particular district. So can you believe this? 75,000 rhesus macaque in one district. So the ACF called me and he said, what to do with this data? I said, I have no idea. When I looked at the data sheet, and they found that there are 3,000 group size. So apparently they went and asked people how many monkeys are there. People said, okay, हजार to hoga. So हजार means 2,000. So हजार is like 3,000. So just they exaggerate the number. I think this happened most often because people tend to attribute human emotions to animals, and this is nothing like a revenge killing or something. Not even in the primates, also not in elephants. But I know that there are certain habitual raiders in elephants. I think Seema will be very much aware of this. So who really do come more often to human habitations and create havoc.
so in elephants, as you were saying, of course, there are very few elephants that are habituate raiders. Also, the killing by them in some ways it looks intentional. Might not be intentional. We have to be very careful over there, but it looks very intentional. And that is one of the reasons that the idea of studying complex behaviors, that if they are doing intentional human killing, why do these behaviors occur?
Mm.
What is the complex behavior behind it? What is the psychology of we might not understand it, but how do we study such psychology, such aspects of animal behavior in some ways, some complex animal behaviors? And also over here I wanted to talk about there is an incident of genocide that I think Jane Goodall talks about in
Mhm.
primates, where a troop of chimpanzees systematically killed the other troop members in an area. So if genocide is a word that has been used for primates in some ways, and intentional killing can take place because of being
Yeah,
territorial.
yeah.
So that was one of the idea, that is it, of course revenge may be a different word, but could that be something else if not revenge?
So I think we really need to use this word very carefully in the scientific literature. So even Jane Goodall, and there are a lot of examples of where chimpanzees do kill, say, the other chimpanzee groups. So, but that is not to take a revenge or something, but to expand their territory. So if they expand it, and then in the as a if you ask me from a behavioral perspective, so you are increasing the areas where you will get resources. So and most of this conflict happened not inside the, say, in the core area of the territory. So if you look at the killing of most of this say incidents or incidences, so these are along the periphery of the territory, not inside the in the core of the territory. So this clearly says that I think the kind of a motive, so if you allow me to use this word, is to expand the territory so that they can have access to better food and uh, yeah. So that is there. And when you see, Sima, when you say that about the individuals, no, I really think there is a individual variation. So in fact, if you remember, there is a primate which started washing potato in Japan, right? So her name was Imo. So there is a one particular individual who somehow understand to wash potato, which is full of say sand, and that particular individual, when she started this washing potato, and that culture has spread, and she's not only not only discovered the washing of potato, but she has also discovered many other things. So definitely in primates or in elephants group, so individual has different temperament, and they have a different ways to solve complex phenomenon. So when you say that the particular individual is coming and always say in conflict with some people, or is the more the aggressor one, I think I'm not be very surprised to do that, because they have a different temperament. So just like a primates, if you look at the primate group, and you'll see that some of the males are rarely engaged in fights, whereas other individuals are continuously fighting with each other. So I think temperament matter, and that's why I think we need to move away from say just so generalizing all individual is same, to the more specific individual based behavioral observation. So I think that will give us much more nuanced so insight into the behavior of elephants and why they behave in the way they do.
So that's a very interesting perspective of moving from looking at herd level and looking at group level and looking at individuals. But how do you include individuals in group study? Like, this is the major challenge that is faced, that how are you going to ever publish if you're going to work only with individuals and not work with groups? Because that's a perspective that we are taught as a young students, that look at herd level, look at group level, and don't look at just the uh, individual level. So that's one of the major challenge.
No, I think now if you are really worried about publication, I think that's the least worried you should have, because my supervisor, Dr. Anindya Sinha, and his team also are looking at the individual elephants' temperaments.
Yeah.
So it's like writing the biography of say one individual of research, or say one individuals of say. So there are journals which allow you to say publish that kind of work also. This is not typical of say the very hypothetical deductive kind of approach or the group based approach, but I think it will actually give you a very deeper insight. It's just like the human society. Like you cannot infer the behavior of the entire family based on say one individual, right? So maybe we, in one family, maybe the temperament of each individual could be very different, right? So I think just if you extend this to animals, right? So it's the same thing. So I think you're right that there is a methodological or the sampling how to do this. So that the methodological challenge, particularly in Northeast India, where you hardly see them, right? Most of them are in the forest. So it may be good for say African elephants, where you may see most of them, or say in the savannah, you can identify individuals there, you can follow them, but Northeast India, that's a challenge, to study them in the forest, because most of the time you hardly see animals in the forest, for example. So I've never seen tiger so far in the forest in Northeast India. So my tiger sighting was in Mudumalai, not in Northeast India. So because you hardly see them, so it's a different kind of a challenge that is there.
Yes, completely understand. And moving now again from behavior to conservation, one of the major conservation question is, of course, when you talk about Northeast, rhinos have taken a front foot, and primate conservation have taken completely a back foot. So how do we think and we can overcome this? Because there is a high level of primate species that are there, and they were nowhere found in India. How can you move from just rhinos, of course, without undermining the importance of rhinos, because rhinos are only found in the Northeast? How can we also talk about primates?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid question, and you are rightly said that there are a lot of focus on say large mammals like particularly rhino or say tiger. So I'm not saying that these are say bad representative of the biodiversity, but what to do in places where there are no rhino, no elephants, no so there are no rhino or say no tiger. So for example, state like Meghalaya, where there are no tiger, no rhino. So the very concept of the flagship species, tiger is a flagship species, so we cannot use it. So in fact, so what would be better? So if you can project say Hula gibbon, which is totally arboreal species, as a flagship species to conserve tropical rainforest. And tropical rainforest, particularly the tropical lowland rainforest, so which are in fact the most endangered habitat, okay, which are found only I think in Upper Assam. So the tropical lowland rainforest, for them, I think tiger or rhino are not a good surrogate to conservation. So I think rather we should move towards making some of the kind of a project primate or something like that, because the threat is on the tropical forest, and along with the elephants. So if you can also start giving a lot of importance to say primates, I think we can then highlight the precarious condition of this tropical rainforest in the Northeast India. So I worked in Upper Brahmaputra Valley. So there are some 40 odd forest fragments, and you'll be very surprised to know that the primates are sleeping away from this fragment. So there is one particular forest fragment which used to harbor 6 species of primate in a 5 square kilometer area. So since 1995, there was a census by Dr. Anwardin Chaudhary, and after that we started doing census since 2001. and you'll be surprised to know that all 6 primate species almost gone there. So the number of Hulok gibbon, which were 35 in 1995, have decreased, and right now if you go to that particular fragment, there are only 4 individuals of Hulok gibbon. So there is a drastic decline. So that's a story of one such one fragment, and this is the tropical lowland rainforest. One of the major cause of the decline is the habitat loss. So the tiger or rhino, I think, are not going to save this rainforest fragments, or in that way the tropical rainforest in some of the areas. So for example, in Mizoram, so they say there is only one tiger in the entire Dampa Tiger Reserve. So I think we need to move away from so in fact, I would also suggest that even I think if we can project, say, reptiles or some amphibian species as a focus of conservations, I think that will do much better service than just focusing on the, say, tiger or rhino. So I think we have seen that. So focusing one species and putting all your resources there, no doubt that that species has come out of the verge of extinction. We were able to bring that species from the verge of extinction in Kaziranga. So now there are around 33,000 odd rhinos in Assam. I think we should also now focus, because it should not be like only one protected area is there, because we need more such areas. So we cannot afford to lose any such any more forest cover in Northeast India. I think because we have already lost so many forest covers here, so many fragments, in particular in Upper Assam. So I think it's partly because of our overemphasis on this very charismatic and very visible species. I think we need to promote primate as the flagship species if we really want to conserve the tropical lowland rainforest in Northeast India.
Thank you, sir, for this interactive session. Now I'll hand over to Aksha to open questions from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for sharing your experiences and giving us an insight about the primate ecology and kind of.
Thank you, Aksha. Have you already handed over to me? Because I could not hear it. Sorry for that.
Can you hear me now, Sanjay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So taking this conversation forward, I would like to request Sanjay to take forward the question answer session. I think our audience have some questions. So Sanjay, please take over the question answer.
Yes. Thank you so much, Aksha. And I would like to thank you, Dr. Sharma and Seema. I must say it was very interesting, and you put together, both of you have touched based on several aspects. So it's already become very multidimensional, I would say. And we have a couple of questions from the audience also, which I would like to take it up. So I would begin with the first observation and comment from Tanzim, where she said that she recently done some research and watched some documentaries, and she says that people don't really want to share boundaries with animals, and main reasons is conflict, obviously. So she wants views. So that's one. Second, I would like to combine another question from Arvind. Arvind, right? Instead of human-wildlife conflict, the palm cultivation is being pushed forward. Is there any mechanism developed to keep a balance between economy and maintain the diversity? So why I'm combining these two questions, because and one more, what is a fortress conservation, right? So let me combine the fortress conservation and the main reasons for the people don't want to share the boundaries. So I would like to combine these questions, because these coming from more from a people point of view. So while these questions are there, I would like to add one more question from my end, where I would like to check So there's a lot of research that is happening in the species on the primates and elephants. So side by side, is there a significant research happening on the human part of it? Because Seema talked about the fortress conservation, the approach from fortress to the community. So I would like to request both of you to shed a light on the terminology. That's Arvind want to know. And the question that I put it across, that how much research are we doing on the human, on the community, and is this significant comparing to the wildlife species in the world?
Okay, I'll go ahead and say about forest conservation. Forest conservation was a term that was termed in olden terms, like from the big NGOs, when they were looking at protecting at least the protected areas. Like certain places, certain areas need to be protected. Like let's say Kaziranga, which was an area, which was a landscape, which needs to be protected. And everybody looked only within the park, and whatever was happening outside the park was not taken into consideration. Hence the idea that you are making a protected area fortress, like making a fort over the protected area, and excluding the people out of it, and not having the humans, because earlier humans used to cultivate in that area. Humans used to, at least the cattle used to graze in the area. Now you are bifurcating that this is an area which is only restricted to wildlife, and there should not be any human presence in the area. And that idea was forest conservation. Now what are people moving towards is a landscape level approach, where they are talking about communities that are living outside the protected areas. There are people who are talking about the health of the communities. What benefits are they getting? The ecosystem services, what benefits and ecosystem services are they getting outside from the protected areas, as well as what tourism services they are providing, and what benefits are they getting out of it. Of course, when Sanjay asked this question, when he said that are humans, studies for humans being done in that way outside the protected areas at community level, I would suggest not as much as required, because there is a lot of there's one Manborua's paper that has come up, which has talked about this long-term physiological stress that goes through when you live so close to a protected area, or where you live in this tension that maybe this area could be either be evacuated simply. People could evacuation could orders could come up any day, or else there could be laws that can change really at certain point of time, because sometimes it's like this is a protected area. Outside this, let's say some law says that till 1 kilometer there is an ecosystem zone where you cannot have any of these big industries, big mining industries, or we should not have any of the tourism, major tourism centers. But then the same law is bent in a lot of places, and this buffer areas outside the protected areas are not very well defined, and which is the reason that is happening, that the communities don't feel so secure about living close to the protected areas, because the laws also keep changing, and it is also a very state-wise buffers that zones have to be defined. So do you want to add something on it?
No, I think so. That Manborua's paper is one of the classical paper. I think very highly cited paper. So where he actually said about this the human dimension of wildlife conservation. So what happened when the elephant rate crops? So he highlighted these three costs. So one is the opportunity cost. For example, if you have to keep guarding your crop all the time, you lost opportunity. For example, there are school dropout, college dropout, so people are not able to go to, say, college or school, and because they have to be in the field all the time, the most of the people actually started resorting to alcohol. So this also having, because they are psychologically, the deprivation of sleep, because that has a psychological impact. And he also said about the transaction cost. For example, so elephant came and destroy your crop, right? And in order to procure the compensation, you have to make multiple visits to forest department, right? So while doing so, it's not like so if you go from one place to another, you need to say buy tickets, and by the time you get compensation amount which is lesser than the amount that you spent, so that there's a transaction cost, right? And the third is the health impact, what Seema said about it, because I think this is an area I think we need to perhaps collaborate with the psychologist or say people who do counseling, and to see what are the impact that's happening. So in Sundarban, for example, when the tiger come and lift the husband, and they do not get to see the say the dead body of the husband. So apparently women are under severe depression. So I think I don't remember the exact figure. So I think we need to also understand the human dimension of the human elephant conflict. So which very nicely written by Man Barua and his team, and I really encourage all of you to read that paper. And I think one area which is I think what Tanjeem said about the human wildlife conflict, and people do not say boundaries. You know what? So this is actually not true. So if you go to Northeast India, and also Seema said, so there will be some 11 carcasses of elephants killed because of the poisoning, and the next morning people are going with garlands and flowers to pay homage, right? So they consider them as a god. In one of the forest area which is next to Guwahati, it's called the Rani Reserved Forest. So I have been working in that village for last 2 to 3 years, and I found that this village is in the middle of the forest, and there are elephants around. So I said, elephant, they do come. They said, yeah, elephant do come here. So what do you do? They said, no, they will come, and we do not disturb them, or we do not say harm them in any which way. They will come and they will just pass through this village. So you will be surprised that there are no human casualty or elephant casualty in that village for the longer time. So I think there is this coexistence model where, and the biggest problem is the crowd management. So most of the time the crowd wanted to go and take selfies, and in that, and they will go go very close to the elephants, and these are the times when the people are getting killed by the elephants. And also I think what is very important is to look at the gender issues. When you look at the conflict, the both genders are not equally affected. In some areas, the females are more affected because there are elephants in the forest. You cannot go and get firewood, and the male people are the primary responsible for to go and guard the crops. So I think there is a gender issue also. There is a PhD scholar, Sayan Banerjee, who is looking at the gender issue in human wildlife conflict in Northeast India, particularly in Udalguri district of Assam. So I think there are a lot of these different studies that are happening. You are right, Sanjay. And I think and there are also this people are started understanding the nuances of the relationship. So it's not like a black and white or conflict or say coexistence. So people started looking at this in the term of the continuum. Right? So this kind of a gradient. So where your attitude or your behavior is completely positive, you kind of a stewardship. And in some cases, they are completely negative, and you can very much understandable because you have a parcel of land and you have paddy there, and that's a sole source of your income. So if an elephant comes and destroy that, you cannot just sit ideal or not show your anger and say, okay, these are gods. No. I think that people have every right to be resented, and the top of that, the delay in the compensation is aggravating the problem, and people are resorting to electrocution. So most of the death in the recent past are because of people putting this high wire electric to the electric fences, and as a result, there are a lot of electrocution that happening in Gwalpara and also in the Manas landscape. So people are like, and you should understand that why they go up to that extent to kill their gods, right? So I think if we understand that, then we can also manage this conflict in a better way.
Absolutely. It's always a very it cannot be black and white, as you rightly said. It's a multidimensional. It has to be studied more. It has to be studied further. So just a next leading question to that, again, more from a psyche. So Nupur asked this question where she says that, can you please comment on gibbon and human interaction? If you
Okay. So gibbon and human, I think it's a very, very cordial relationship, I must say. So I worked in Meghalaya, I worked in Mizoram, and I worked in Assam. So everywhere, so people consider gibbon as their like a family, So if you go to Garo Hills, you will see gibbons in the villages. So people have that kind of, okay, these are our gibbons. Okay, so they will not kill them. So in Mizoram, there are many places where they do not kill gibbons. They said they will kill every other primate species, but they will not kill gibbons. And there is a place called Barekuri in Upper Assam, where Barekuri means say there are 20 hamlets. So right now there are 19 individuals of Hula gibbon scattered in this village. So this is completely cut off from the natural forest, and people are protecting this gibbon. So they feed them with banana and whatever fruits they have, and they have a very, very good relationship. So primarily because gibbons do not destroy destroy the crops or say fruits. And I think if they will not be able to tolerate the presence of rhesus macaque, but they will tolerate the presence of Hula gibbon in there. So I must say that in some part they do hunt Hula gibbons, but people have these taboos. If the Hula gibbon is a pregnant one, they will not kill. So I have seen this in Mizoram. So that people say that, well, okay, we'll not kill Hula gibbon if the female is pregnant. So they have this idea of not killing them. And in some places they said they do kill Hula gibbon. So for example, Dampa, I heard that because Dampa, there is a prevalence of malaria. So there is this very superstitious belief that if you drink the hot blood of Hula gibbon, that will cure malaria. I think because of this superstitious, earlier they used to kill Hula gibbon or hunt Hula gibbon and drink their blood. But I think after awareness and other things, I think the incident had come down. So, but it's wherever I went, Garo Hills or say Jaintia Hills in Meghalaya and Upper Assam in Upper Brahmaputra Valley in Assam, and the Mizoram where I worked. So I found a very cordial relationship with people with Hula gibbons.
Right. Very interesting. So there is one question, very interesting question coming from Samiha, where she is specifically asking you, Dr. Sharma, where she says that have you come across any situation where it's all crowded, because you quoted about crowd and management. She is wondering how to deal with such situation and what should be talked at such places when people are angry and be it an elephant or a gibbon and macaques, what should be done in such kind of situations. Please allow me to combine one more question with that, just in the view of the time. So you very interestingly, you said that there are a lot of, human emotions which have, kind of put it on top of the actual situation. So, and it's always about, conveying the science, conveying the facts, which always a very, very void in the society, from the ages. So similarly, how to do that? Is anybody as a spokesperson to the wildlife exist, and to what extent the efforts are happening? So on the same line.
Okay, so I'll go with the first question by Samya, and perhaps I'll ask you I'll repeat the second question once again. So I think the crowd management, so there should be some coordination between the forest department, revenue department, police department, and there should be, I think there are guidelines. It's not like people haven't thought about it, or I'm the first person who people have thought about it. There are guidelines by MOE of how to tackle crowds. I think if you follow those, I think there is a very elaborately they have mentioned how to go ahead with it. So I think only thing is that we need to implement it. So it's not just a forest department problem. I think it's a problem where the police department should also be there. Perhaps the revenue department, perhaps the district administration should come into. So if there are this conflict kind of situations, and the question is how often will you do it? So because in a landscape where the forest department gear up to chase elephant when it becomes like 5 or 6 p.m., how long you'll be able to do this? So what are the, I think we need to look at the root cause of these problems. So what to do with the elephants which are there in a 20 square kilometer? There are 40 elephants. What will you do? I think we need to really think about it. So should we like continuing having these elephants in that fragment in the fragment of 20 square kilometer, which is not even the area that they can roam in a night, right? What to do with those elephants? I think we need to think about it. So should we continue living with them? Should we continue spending resources to manage it? Should we continue accepting the mortalities of both human and the elephants in that landscape, or can we do something else, right? And translocation, as you know, is not a good idea because they have this homing instinct, particularly the cat species like leopards and others. For elephants also in South India, I think they did try to translocate one elephant from Hassan to Bandipur, and this elephant came to Hassan after traveling some 180 kilometers. So what to do with those elephants? I think we need to think about those and take some of the decision that is both beneficial for the elephant welfare and also for the humans. Because if there are large, that's why I think there was one suggestion by Dr. M.D. Madhusudan, so who said that we need to create a zone. So where in one zone the elephant will get priority, in other zone the human will get priority, and then there is a zone where both human and wildlife can coexist. So whether that kind of zonation will help, I don't know. So I think we need to go beyond so even if you have to remove say 2 or 3 problematic animals and put them either in zoo or some other places, that's perfectly fine with me. If as long as that is helping so we are reducing the lot of mortalities of people there. So you cannot have like a tons of like a dozen or thousands of people and elephants coming and killing every time. I think we need to really take some very, very hard decision in those places.
Right. So I would like to repeat my question. So you rightly say that one need to look at the root cause and try to address it, and that's how a different thought process emerges, and those being tried and tested and implemented and taken it forward at a policy level. Whereas when it comes to educating and masking those unwanted facts, where there are different words has been used like a revenge and badla.
Yeah.
Who does take a responsibility of uncovering the facts? So yes, there are research papers, there are scientific forums where these being uncovered, but when it comes to common people, are there any forums exist in India, and how effective those are? For instance, talking about Friends of Elephants, and the audience who come from all different walks of life. So likewise, and this is at a very, very, I would say, small level. So is there anything happening? Is it fragmented? Is it? Would you like to share something, sir?
No, I think the forum, I think it's mostly right now this Facebook is some people who can afford to go live and watch them and burn their data, right? So what to do with the people who do not have like that kind of internet connectivity, and who are the people who are suffered the most? So we are not suffering. So elephants are not coming to my village. How to go and do this work? And also I think NGO here played a major role. in creating awareness. And but what happened with the NGO is that the funds are limited. So what to do? If you get funds for 1 year or 2 year, and then there is a dearth of funds. So I think we are also fighting with the limited funds, and I think in this case the media plays a very, very important role. So I must say that how media project is how people also say construct their perceptions or opinions. So if the media is extremely hostile towards this kind of thing, they sensationalize things, just like what happened in this 250 dog being killed in some place. I think people start making, okay, this rhesus macaques are the killer or something like that. So so if you look at the headlines of the media, right? So media can make or break. So I think and social media is also very important. So do not exaggerate these things while writing. I think just say you need to write with restraint. So more you understand, less you write actually. So that is my feeling, and more conscious you become with your words. And sometimes what happened, Sanjay, is that people, for example, that Satargaon village near Rani Garbanga, people do not know the conflict. So if I start going and asking them, okay, do you have conflict? They will understand. Okay, oh, there is a conflict term, and if I apply, I'll get money. Then they will start using this term called conflict, and they will go and unnecessary apply for the compensation. So unwittingly, most of the researcher, I think it's our responsibility not to put word into their mouth. I think this is also responsibility of research, because I never go and talk about elephants there. I just ask them, and that's it. So I'll not go and say, well, do they break this thing? Do they do this in this place? There are a lot of conflicts. Or do you have this conflict in your areas? No, I think I'll rather sacrifice my data and then put some word which they can use in the future. Actually, where there is no such things called conflict in that area. I think we need to be a little bit cautious also while talking to people, and do not talk what Samia asked is like, if there are a lot of these elephants are coming and raiding crops, do not go and talk immediately to those places. So they will be completely will not be able to cooperate with you. So I had similar incidents when I wanted to take pictures and I got almost thrashed by the mob. So I think we need to be really cautious when we are dealing with this kind of situation.
It's very nice of you to share that, about your personal experience about taking a picture. So next thing I would like to check, and this is coming from Aksha, where she asked, you talked about this commonality between primates and elephants is a bamboo, one of the observation. So similarly, there would be multiple observations, be it a common concern or be it common ecological factors. So is there any kind of a conservation plan in place where these commonality between species are considered while doing a conservation planning at the first level? Yeah. Second level, if that is considered, anything that you would like to share?
So I think these are some of the very stray incidents. So I haven't gone there and with a kind of a design to understand the specific interactions. So why not? I think someone can take this as a project and look at if there are commonality or how. So because they are not isolated, right? Elephants or primates. So this must be having some sort of interaction. For example, if you know that cheetal and elephant, or deer or elephant, so elephants are going and deers are also following them. So there is interaction between them. So I think if we understand, if we design that kind of a study, so these are just stray incidents that I reported here, but this was not a very systematic survey that I did, or I have a lot of data on it. So why not? I think if we have that kind of interactions where one species is having a positive impact on other species, and definitely we should also include them in the conservation plan. So for example, bamboo become a very major source of food for both primates and the elephants. And we might consider not to replace bamboo and plant trees there. Right. So what happened, like people, if you see the bamboo, and the first thing that forest department or the social forestry people say, okay, just cut the bamboo and plant trees. Right. So perhaps you can go and tell them that no, bamboo is a very important resources for both primates and the elephants, and it would be better if we keep this area like this, not removing bamboo from there. Right. So definitely that kind of interactions or those insight will help my conservation plan. In fact, most of my PhD work actually feed into the management plan of Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary. That's a very, very heartening and satisfying feeling for me. So the forest department is also looking forward to incorporate the scientific findings and how to improve the management of the park. So I think it's not like they will be very, very afraid of it. I think there are a lot of misunderstanding that's the forest department or the researcher, they do not talk to each other. So I think that's not true always. I think from my own experience, I can definitely tell you that a lot of the research findings found places in the management plan of some of the protected area in Upper Assam. So I must say that one.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting. And please pardon me, I'm asking an academic question basis what you just shared. And you talked about research findings getting incorporated into management plan. So are we at a stage now where we have a different species to conserve, and there are commonalities, there are common concerns like the connectivity? It's a major ask.
Yes.
Into the primates, right? So are we at a juncture now that we have to look at ecosystem level conservation planning? Pardon me if it is an academic question, but I just thought of asking, because you say a very positive aspect that the findings are being fed into the management plan and taken it forward. So are we at a juncture where it has to be looked at an ecosystem level than a species level?
Absolutely. I think so. It depends, Sanjay, that it depends from place to place. In some place, I think we have to go for species level conservation. So, for example, we cannot just say, okay, if we conserve Manas National Park, all the pygmy hog will be saved. No. I think we need to interfere. And they rightly did so by bringing them into captive breeding and then releasing them to the wild. I think it's a case to case basis, and in some part, I think you are right. I think ecosystem based approaches where so particularly it's important for the restoration work. So restoration, I think the work or the restoration of forest or grassland or any other ecosystem should be at the ecosystem level, right? So and which is very much needed in Northeast India. So if you look at all this reserve forest or say protected areas, most of them need restoration work. So the land is still there. The good thing is that land is still with the forest department. It is not being completely occupied by the people. But I think we need to have a rapid and it should be done in next 5 or 10 years, definitely. So we need to restore this. At that time, I think we will not go for the species level strategy, but rather go for an ecosystem level strategy. So how to bring back, say, string, how to bring back pollinators in the system. Right? How to bring back an ecosystem that can be used by, say, butterflies, birds, or say reptiles or amphibians. I think if for the restoration of many degraded areas, I think we should focus on the say ecosystem level work, and also like when we do this species level work, I think species which are dire need of our interventions. So if that kind of places, I think we have to go for the species level. So it's not like either this or that. It's just based on what kind of intervention we need. Yeah, right. It's a very, very adaptive one. It should be.
Thank you for taking all the questions very patiently. This is the last question. So it's coming from Arvind has put across a situation where he said you talked about the palm likelihood of palm cultivation coming in Arunachal Pradesh. And then he asked, is there a mechanism where economy and development and conservation can be balanced? So what I would like to ask, the question basis this situation. So you talked about multiple factors. No? You talked about the hunting to a certain extent, the macaques, and even in some cases of gibbons. Then there's electrocution, which Seema talked about. She also talked about the policy level changes are required at that level when it comes to crowd management. So there are different aspects, be it shifting cultivation, crowd management, hunting. So when it becomes a very, very sensitive political issue, then obviously it's become a priority. But if we talk very specific to Northeast landscape, where we have these specific challenges in terms of fragmentation, then there are green cover, but still the quality of the forest is not that great used to be, the requirement of development. So there are several issues and several concerns. So considering each concern, are there efforts by various individuals, organizations, addressing the various situations towards the policy level changes, or is it only the priority which gets addressed? Like there is a fire and then there is a work.
Yeah, so I think it's
yeah. I'm sorry for that, but just to make it more understandable, wanted to check this. Are there policy level changes at all the levels, or it's only the prioritization which goes by the?
So I think what conservation we need to do is to both reactive as well as the proactive, right? Reactive is that something happened and we need to like a firefighting mode, right? And the proactive is like anticipating some of the potential threats. It's like a horizon scanning, right? So palm oil is one of that proactive thing. So it's like a horizon. So because we need to take lessons from Southeast Asia. We need to take what happened to Malaysia, or what happened to Indonesia. So how the palm oil completely devastated this. So whether similar kind of things are going to be in Northeast India, and if you ask me, the question is yes and no. But the possibility of yes is much more higher. So. So who will look after that, whether that particular forest? So if there is you did just a regulation to de-reserve some of the reserve forest and make them forest, so which we can clear it for the palm, right? So but palm is such, I'm telling this to multiple people, palm oil as such is not a bad crop. The per hectare the yield of palm oil is much higher than any other say oil seeds, right? So but the palm is a right crop at the wrong place. So I would say, so Northeast India, I think unless we earmark certain areas which are and very, very strict regulations, so that these are the forests which are not been we should not touch them, and these are the areas where we can do palm. Why not? Right? So there is a paper by Umesh Srinivasan and his team in the Nature Food. So where they said that palm, we can do palm in those areas where the paddy yield is less, right? Because the yield of palm and the benefit of palm from those areas will be much higher than what what farmers are getting from the poor paddy field yield. So there are opportunities where we can do this, but my thing is that we should not compromise with the forest of this region, because these are the insurance, like insurance from everything. So we have forests, we have biodiversities. So these are the wild progenitors of so many crops are there in the wild. So if we lose this insurance, this is a corpus, right? Then I think where to go? So it's like you're going and just taking all the reserve bank's money to run the country, right? If you do that, there is nothing to do it. So it's kind of our reserve bank. So I think we need to protect this, because it's not only for the animal or wildlife, but for the sake of people, for the sake of the traditions, for the sake of culture. So we have this huge culture only because we have a huge biodiversity there. So we have this name for, say, yesterday I was reading one paper where they said that there are people, Adi people can identify 10 different variety of soil. So that traditional knowledge will go if you just replace the entire shifting cultivation area with the palm cultivation. So I think we need to also think from that aspect. So how rich we traditionally we have, and what happen if we just remove all this and just make the entire area palmscape or rubberscape. So that's not going to help neither wildlife nor biodiversity nor people. So they may give you money, but what to do with that money when you cannot buy? You have to buy everything from the market and eat it. Right now you are getting it from your shifting cultivation plot. So 70 plus varieties of crops you are getting from there. So I think we need to weigh this cost and benefit, and move forward very cautiously when we think about the palm.
That's very nicely said, the cost and benefit ratio. Seema, would you like to add anything?
I completely hijacked Seema.
No, sir, it's wonderful to hear you talk because you talk in so much of detail. So I really like listening to you. Of course, when you talk about cost and benefit and looking at development, it's a very tricky road that we will have to make because people do want development. And development is like what we see, good roads, good infrastructure is lacking in the Northeast, in which is very much evident everywhere else. People would like that. But then at cost of what is what the question that the people of Northeast would have to answer. And that's a very difficult trade-off that would have to be made.
Yep.
And I completely understand that the biodiversity in that area is so rich. If there are more linear infrastructure projects that are going to come in, it is going to affect at least during the part if they are making underpass and overpass, which is happening in other places like Kaziranga also. But at least during the construction, the cost of construction of the underpass and overpass is going to have a huge impact on the area. And that is also not taken into consideration most of the time. But how it's gone, but development is required in certain hard ways. So let's see how it goes forward, at least in the Northeast. Yes,
Thank you
Sanjay.
so much. And I really enjoyed listening to both of you. And as I said, and I would like to repeat in the cost of repetition, that you absolutely touch based on several aspects, be it ecological, biological, social, policy level, political. And I'm sure, people who have not joined today, we received a couple of emails that they would like to see it on the YouTube later. I think they're going to have really a lot of insights from this conversation. I would like to thank Dr. Narayan Sharma for being here and patiently taking questions. I would like to thank you, Seema, for coming in, very beautifully explaining the Northeast landscape, and I would say the technology in a nice and very nice manner that we could absorb it nicely. Thank you so much for both of you to be here today. And I would like to thank participants also to be patiently listening throughout the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and thank you everyone for the nice questions. I think the questions stimulate the brain, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having us.
And have a great coming year, I would say. Whatever we talked about, I'm absolutely pumped up to take it forward in the next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay.
Thank you.